going to begin by talking about this talk is just going to be a very general overview, starting from the premise that the United States is a profoundly racist society. I'm going to focus on racism towards African Americans, not because there aren't other racisms. In the United States, there are many. We could have a whole session on racism against Arabs and Muslims, which is a very important dynamic in the United States right now. Racism against Latinos, against Mexicans. I mean, there's just so many dimensions to racism in the United States today. So really, I'm focusing on African Americans, but I'm doing so for a reason, not only because it's an area of interest for me, but because racism against African Americans is in many ways the foundation of American society. It is a touchstone of American democracy, in the words of the radical socialist of 100 years ago, Hubert Harrison, who said that it's the proof that gives lie to all the claims that America makes about itself. And it's really a foundation upon which other oppressions and exploitations are built in American society. It's very central to understanding American society, which is why I'm going to focus on that. I'm also going to try to explain something about the way Marxists approach this question and these questions in general, because there is some debate about this in American society right now, especially on the American left, which I'll mention just a little bit about. The first thing is, of course, being a deeply racist society, there are racist ideas. There are many widely spread racist ideas. You can find any number of polls of people who will cop to explicit anti-black prejudices. In some polls, up to 50% of the population will just openly admit having racist attitudes about African Americans. But an important starting point for us as socialists and Marxists is that we think that racism is not just a matter of ideas. It's not just bad ideas, and if only we could dispel those ideas. But that racism is a material fact shaping people's lives. There's so many statistics. I don't want to go on with a whole catalog of statistics that prove the material fact of racism. And by the way, we should separate out the terms that we use, racism, as opposed to race. Because we know from biology that race does not exist, that there is no such thing. There is a human race, and then there are phenotypes and physical forms that different people take. But we know that there's more genetic variation within the so-called races than between them. So while race, we would argue, is not real, racism very much is real. It's a very real factor shaping people's lives. In fact, African Americans in the United States contract HIV at a rate that is 7 times that of whites. They're more likely to die from a whole number of diseases, including cancer. For cancer in the United States, African Americans contract cancer or develop cancers at a rate that's higher than any other group in the United States. Nearly after the Civil Rights Movement fought to desegregate schools, nearly 2/3 of children of African descent in the United States are now back to segregated schools, schools where people of their complexion are the overwhelming majority of the people in that school. And when you just talk about a material fact, let's talk about wealth. Who's got what kind of wealth in the United States? In 2010, nearly half of all single black women had 0 or negative net worth, meaning that their debts exceeded any or all of their assets. The median black wealth right now for a single black woman is just about $100. If you liquidate all your assets, that's what you can come up with in a pinch. For Hispanics, incidentally, it's $120, to give you a sense. But for single white women, the median figure, like if you liquidate everything, sell the car, sell the house, pay down all the bills, what have you got left? $41,000. Not a worldly sum, but you can see right there, to say racism is just ideas, hell no. It's a very material fact of life, shaping people's life outcomes in real ways that have material consequences. And also, even though, of course, we have an African-American president, all kinds of African-Americans have shattered all kinds of barriers and found entry to all kinds of places that we haven't in the past, still, it's actually overwhelmingly true that the halls and corridors of power are overwhelmingly dominated by white men in the United States. Make no mistake about it. Overwhelmingly, 82% of Congress is white. 96% of the Senate, white. 78% of Fortune 500 companies, the board seats are held by white men. 82% of nonprofit CEOs, even like, the do-gooder foundations, white. The 88% of newsroom managers, white. So there is something going on that I'm going to describe later on, and a rise of a class of people who have penetrated some of these corridors, but make no mistake, it is still overwhelmingly white. In fact, I think it's safe to say that it's still possible in some major American cities for a young African-American person to grow up and really not know people who are white, who are not in positions of authority. To only know white people who are either teachers or administrators or police or that sort of thing, and not know that there are white working class people in the United States. I used to teach elementary grades in Harlem. Last year I taught in Brooklyn. In Harlem, I remember that my first year teaching, one of my students, I was teaching 6th grade, and one of them said something I picked up on. I said, well, let me just stop the discussion here and ask you a question, 6th grader, 11 years old. Do you think that there's more white people or black people in the United States? And they thought that was a dumb question. They were like, duh, Mr. Jones, of course there's more black people in the United States. Even though African Americans are only like 13% of the population. But that just goes to show that this student lives in such a segregated world. In that was in New York City, one of the most cosmopolitan cities on earth. More languages spoken there than nearly any other place in North America. And yet, from his perspective, African Americans are the great majority of the country, of course. I want to talk about the way, so it's not just bad ideas. It's also a material fact of life, but I think we can go even a step further and understand the ways in which racism is structured in the United States. Understand that it's a structural feature still. I want to talk about some of those ways. After World War II, for example, millions of veterans returning from the war, the federal government underwrote home loans for many of those people so that they could develop a suburban life. They built the interstates and the freeways, carved up the cities, and encouraged people to move out of the cities into those homes with mortgages underwritten by the federal government, except that north of 90% of those mortgages went to whites. And many of those subdivisions had contracts for racial exclusivity. And in some cases, the federal government said, we won't underwrite the home unless there is a racial exclusivity contract. So in the United States, where we don't have a great social welfare state, where your home and home ownership is really what creates that huge gulf in your net worth. That is really your retirement for many people, is the fact that you might own a home. It's the only thing that you might be able to leave to your children. And so this was a way structurally in which an enormous gulf was created in terms of who was able to own what, where blacks were trapped in the cities. And I'm saying, in other words, the segregation wasn't just like whites chose to live over here and blacks chose to live over here. It was organized. It was an organized segregation of the population. And then, come to find out that blacks then are pressing, and other groups who are kept out of homeownership are then pressing to be let into homeownership, except that they're overwhelmingly sold increasingly subprime mortgages. They did a study of places, of major American cities, 100 of the largest cities in America, said, where are the subprime loans? And coincidentally, where the subprime loans were matched up to where people of color overwhelmingly live. And so when we had the mortgage meltdown and homes went into foreclosure, the same map of where the foreclosures was happening matched up with where African Americans live. In fact, one writer estimates that the subprime mortgage meltdown of 2008 was the single greatest destruction of black wealth in a single stroke in United States history. A huge event. And so that's why you see places that were the strongholds of black communities, like Detroit, where there's whole blocks boarded up. Homes went into foreclosure and people kicked out. And then, when people pointed out this racist pattern, they turned around and blamed blacks. And said, well, you were taking on a mortgage you couldn't afford. And so you see the way in which we understand that these subprime loans, which means you start off with this like kind of, liar loan. You start off with this easy percentage on your mortgage, and then it balloons later. And suddenly your monthly payments blow up. And the people who were selling these and then chopping them up into derivatives and passing them on made huge profits. And then when they get called out on it, they turn around and use the racist ideas that are out there about African Americans to blame them and avoid blame themselves. And so this is one of the ways in which there's an interplay between structures of racism and the ideas of racism. That is, that the ideas of racism benefit people who are making money off of racism. And that's why I think as Marxists, we have to always try to, it's not always easy, it's not always one-to-one, it's not always about immediate profit. However, I think we always want to reassert that there is always a connection between the underlying structures of the economy, between the way life is materially structured and the ideas in people's heads. That those two things are always in a dynamic interplay with each other, and never do they take on a life of their own or truly have some logic that is totally divorced and separated from what's happening on the ground. And here we see a classic example where there was a racist structure in who owns a home. And then when it's called out, they play upon pre-existing racist ideas and bolster them about, black people that are irresponsible with their money, this kind of thing, in order to get away with it. In the end, Wells Fargo paid a $175 million settlement quietly for discriminatory loan practices. Countrywide paid $335 million to not admit fault in any kind of a racist thing. I mean, there's so much we could talk about this. We could talk about the economics of the ghetto. Payday loans, places where if you can't afford the fees of a regular bank account, then in order to get your paycheck cashed, you have to go to somebody who's going to charge you huge percentages just to get your check turned into cash. And so your money doesn't go as far. Or because you're trapped in your neighborhood and have difficulty traveling to places where it might be cheaper to buy fresh fruits and vegetables, you end up buying inferior products, out-of-date products at a higher rate. Or you might be charged per square foot for your crappy little apartment. You might be charged more than somebody pays per square foot out in the suburbs or in a nicer area. And so there's all kinds of ways in which people who are trapped in a geographical area, who are segregated in a geographical area, actually that becomes very profitable that those people are trapped there. And you can, through all kinds of little fees and penalties, you were late with this little thing, $27. Oh, you forgot to... That'll be an extra $30 charge just for you to do this basic transaction. All these ways you get nickel and dimed when you are in that kind of a circumstance. And that's why I think we also have to insist that as important as it can be for people to have workshops and things that offer opportunities for introspection, that racism is in a very fundamental way not just a question of your personal property, something that just emerges from your eyes or emerges from your brain. But that there's no way to reflect your way out of the payday loans. There's no way to reflect your way out of who gets home ownership and who doesn't. These are deep structures in our economy, or in the economy from where I come from, that are racist. Okay, let me move on. I think one of the things that's so exciting about Michelle Alexander's book, I think there's like one copy out there. So everybody go at once. There's her book, which I referred to last night. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. My God, it's hot in here. Whew. Oh, sorry.
So fun.
Yeah, really. Let's all just take a minute. Let's take a break. Part of the reason her book is so important is that it's bringing back an analysis of racism that rather than being rooted in interpersonal dynamics, which of course are a feature of racism. Of course, once set in motion, once established as the dominant way of looking at the world, leads to all kinds of messed up interpersonal dynamics. Of course. But what she attempts to do in this book is step back and understand racism in the broadest scale in terms of its social purpose. Really what she's bringing back is political economy of racism. And I think that's a really important thing for us to identify with and build on her analysis. But basically what she says is that essentially there is a new legal category. Although, of course, Jim Crow segregation in the southern states was abolished by the civil rights movement, by the legislation in the mid-60s that legally overthrew it, and then in practice fought to desegregate all kinds of areas of American society. But that essentially things that you could do to somebody in the old Jim Crow South, you can now legally do again to people if they fall into a certain legal black hole called felony conviction. Seriously. And then she goes through it. Thank you. People who have been convicted of a felony in the United States can be denied access to public housing. If they go for a job interview, very often there's a little box where you have to check if you have had a felony conviction, and you can legally, for that reason, be denied the job. Legally. You can be denied college loans or any kind of financial assistance to go to college. You can be denied military employment. You can be denied health care. You can crucially be denied the right to vote, and in many states are, so that you might try to attempt to change any of that. So literally, you are in a legal black hole wherein it is legal to materially discriminate against you and make it impossible for you to build any kind of life for yourself. So we have millions of people, I think it's right now something like 5 million people in the United States walking around outside of prison. I mean, we could talk about the people, what's happening to people inside of prison. These are people who are outside of prison and have been released, but are basically still in jail. They're in a kind of invisible cage that surrounds them wherever they go and can legally be discriminated against. And here's the kicker. Overwhelmingly, the people who get felony convictions are black. Overwhelmingly. Again and again. I just read a report that the New York Police Department spent 1 million man-hours last year to make 440,000 arrests for just one offense. Can you guess what that offense was? This one type of offense that they went after for 1 million man-hours, and they made 440,000 arrests for marijuana. I mean, wow. Right, the crime of the century, marijuana, smoking marijuana. My God. And of course, they didn't go banging down, kicking down people's doors on the Upper East Side or, the kind of neighborhoods where people like billionaire Mayor Bloomberg, they didn't go to those neighborhoods grabbing people off the streets for suspicion of marijuana. They went to places where people had all the wrong complexions and harassed them and kicked down their doors and searched them and stopped them on the street and frisked them to try to find marijuana and give them convictions. That is how you could get to a point, and actually the statistic I read out I said at the last night's rally was slightly incorrect. What I meant to say was, it's not the number of people now in prison, it's the number of people under the supervision of the criminal justice system. That means in jail, on parole, or living this post-felony conviction life are now a greater group of people than were slaves in 1850. In fact, the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves actually has a little exception worded into it. It's like, except in the case of incarceration. So there's no more slavery than I say, except if in case of incarceration. And so now you actually have the growth, bless you, of for-profit prisons. A multi-billion-dollar industry. I think they took in $3 billion in profit last year. The top executives were making something like $3 million, who literally have a structural incentive. They make money by putting human beings in cages. So once again, we have a structural feature here. And I think here's where I want to just introduce some of the debates that are going on right now. Because there's debates about, what you might have heard of as like white skin privilege or critical race theory. There's different theoretical lenses with which people try to analyze and understand racism. But I think the important thing that makes Marxism a superior theoretical tool for understanding racism is that Marxism helps us understand the hows and whys. Because first of all, we understand that racism has changed dramatically over time. It's not the same exact ideology as it was during the time of slavery. And the ideology about African Americans during slavery had a particular character which had to do with slavery and the need to have them working for free. And then during Jim Crow segregation, there's a different flavor to the racism against African Americans. And so too today, there's a different nature of a different sense of what racism looks like. Michelle Alexander says that the meaning of being black in America today is to be a criminal. That is, you walk down the street, you're a criminal. It's assumed that you are engaged in some kind of criminal enterprise just for being black. And I think one of the things that we have to ask the question is why? Why, after slavery is abolished, we understand slavery. It's like they wanted to get rich and work them for free. Like that makes sense, right? And we understand that in the Jim Crow era, there was actually a labor upsurge after slavery in which it was important to divide the workforce. But once Jim Crow is overthrown, why is it that they need racism today? Why is it that they would go through all this expense to put so many people in jail and chase down so many people for marijuana? Why would they do that? Why so much stop and frisk? And I think the answer to that has to do with what happened in the 60s and 70s in the United States. Because what happened when you looked at, when you look at who led the last great explosion of social struggle in the United States, not just what you know of as the civil rights movement or even the Black Power movement, but let's go beyond that, because of course there was that. And of course that helped to crack open many other struggles. But ask yourself about the soldiers' revolt in Vietnam. Who led the soldiers' revolt in Vietnam? Ask yourself about the wildcat strikes in the 60s and especially in the 70s in auto, in the post office. Who led those struggles? On so many fronts. Think about the student occupations that challenged the role of various administrations in terms of that, first of all, created women's studies and black studies, and also challenged the complicity of many universities in the Vietnam War. Who led those building occupations? Who led the student movement? In many cases, you're talking about black people. Black people in the United States in the 60s and 70s, I think it's no exaggeration to say, were the vanguard of the American working class movement, the most militant section. There's a book that goes through it, talks about how even white workers who had not yet come to a kind of fully anti-racist position, in many cases were voting in black caucuses, like, yeah, I want him running my union, yes, because they were the militants. And so you start to understand this new Jim Crow, this criminalization actually solved many problems for the American ruling class all at one stroke. Because not only did it take people who were looked at as national heroes, not only Martin Luther King had a huge white following, but go back and reread Malcolm X's autobiography. And the end part, he talks about how he gets letters every day, dozens of letters, and he says most of them are from white people. Most of them are from white people. White people had the idea that, wow, black people are fighting. People admired them for fighting. People wanted to be like them for fighting. People wanted to figure out how to fight like them. And that's a very dangerous thing. And the ruling class had to figure out how to put that genie back in the bottle. And so instead of making black people like the people you look up to, the people you admire, the people you want to be like, the people you want to fight, it's like, they're the people you're afraid of. They're the people you have to be scared of. You have to cross the street. You have to watch out for them. They're the animals. They're the today's terrorists. They criminalize black people as an ideological attack. And that gives you a sense of the nature of racism changing. It's an ideological attack on African Americans focusing on the issue of crime. But it also did another thing, that by making it nearly impossible to make a life for yourself with a felony conviction, you effectively remove from the workforce that militant section. You take them out of the workplace where they can be influential and put them in bars. And then when they get out of bars, you keep them in a kind of social bars, isolated from the rest of the population. And then you look at the places where blacks manage to hang on, because overwhelmingly professional black women today, still today, work for the state, are in the public sector, and many of them are in unions. So you're talking about one of the conquests of the civil rights, oh my goodness. One of the conquests of the civil rights and black power movement was public sector employment and unionization in the public sector. So you're talking about teachers, you're talking about all kinds of government employees, the post office. And funny, who are the people today who are being attacked the most, who are being vilified the most in the press today? It's public sector workers. So you're taking the last stronghold of black workers and destroying it. And a place like Detroit, like my family's, that's why I was born in Detroit, teachers, auto workers, gone. Totally obliterated. Not only a stronghold of American industry and of the American working class, but of the black power, black working class power, gone, destroyed, eviscerated. And I think that begins to explain, it's that kind of dynamic interplay that's going on between the needs of the ruling class, a social plan that they groped towards to smash the movements of that era. During the Clinton, and it's not just like the right wing, again, we have to understand, it's the liberals. Under Bill Clinton's administration, he took $17 billion out of the budget for public housing, and nearly that exact same figure, it's actually 19 billion, went into prisons. So it's almost like prisons became a new form of public housing in America. And we can't forget, Martin Luther King died fighting for public sector workers. Why was he in Memphis? Because black sanitation workers were going on strike to try to win unionization. Okay. I think to get at I gave you the quote before about the huge disparities between median black wealth and white wealth. I think that the concept of like white skin privilege, which is a big argument in the United States, I just feel like it misses something because it very much personalizes racism, as if racism is the personal property of individuals walking around with privileges. And so I don't know, to be honest with you, I really don't know what the right word for it is. But I think our starting point has to be that racism is the cause of these extreme material differences between the life outcomes of whites and the life outcomes of blacks. The overall net worth of whites and blacks has actually fallen 40% in the past 3 years. And at the same time, the wealth of the top 1% has risen. I think for all of them, like people making over $300,000 a year, it's like it went up 10%. And as you get into smaller and smaller slices of the 1%, it went up even more. So their wealth is expanding while all of us are losing out. But of course, African Americans are losing out even more. And so I don't think it's right to say that whites in America are taking that from blacks. It's like the rich are taking it from both of us. But they're attacking African Americans in a way to preserve in a very deep and structural way these divisions. Right now, or at least in 2010, the median net worth of a white household, again, all assets, car, stock, house, $110,000. The median net worth of a black household, $4,900. So it's a huge material gulf. But for both of those groups, that's a precipitous drop from just a few years before. For whites, it dropped by about $20,000 in just 3 years. And for blacks, it dropped by $8,000. So basically, since 2008, since the crisis, both groups have seen their wealth drop enormously. But for blacks, it's much worse. They started at a lower point, and they lost out more, because of the housing situation. Now, here's the weird thing about America today. It's that many of the people who still bear, in some cases, the scars on their heads from the freedom rides or from the police baton from the civil rights movement or from fighting the Klan, people who fought the civil rights movement and won the smashing of Jim Crow, and who deserve our admiration and credit for that. In many cases, people who went on and radicalized and became Black Power activists are dead or in prison. But then there's another group of them for whom doors were opened. Offices and power was opened up to them. In 1970, we had about 1,000 black elected officials 1,500 black elected officials in the whole of the United States, compared to over 9,000 today. You started to see in the 70s majority black cities electing black mayors. But then what did those black mayors do? Overwhelmingly, they turned around and attacked the black working class. So even though King died fighting for sanitation workers, the first black mayor of Atlanta turned around and broke a black sanitation union. The first black mayor of Philadelphia dropped a bomb on black activists, literally firebombed a home from above, dropped a bomb, and that was the Black Freedom Movement that Mumia Abu-Jamal was a part of. That's Wilson Goode, the first black mayor of Philadelphia. And then you see that group now turns around and preaches to everybody. And Obama is like the worst about this. He's one of the people who does this the most. Turns around and preaches personal responsibility. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I did it, so can you. And so it's like, and then the other thing is now every institution in society, legally, on paper, is officially colorblind. Officially discriminates against nobody. The schools admit everybody, except they're super segregated. The housing, there's no exclusion contracts anymore saying blacks can't live here, and yet they're super segregated. You know, there's no, the police, when they pat you down and frisk you, don't say, I stopped him because he's black. They say, I stopped you because you got baggy pants on. As long as you give, if you're dumb enough to give a racial reason for it, then yeah, there's going to be a big hullabaloo and you're probably going to lose your job. But if you're smart enough, as most of them now are, to give a non-racial reason, then that's fine. You can go ahead and stop and frisk every single... In fact, they stopped and frisked more black men in New York City than there are black men in New York City. And as long as every time they give a non-racial reason, it's fine. And so I think what we have to say is that colorblindness, personal responsibility, is the new racism. Michelle Alexander had this one page in the back of the book that just blew my mind. She said, under the old Jim Crow, black success stories challenge the old Jim Crow. They say black people can't do anything. See, we have a doctor. See, we have a celebrity. See, we have a surgeon. The new Jim Crow, she says, must have black success stories. The new Jim Crow must have them because the whole ideology of it is they did it. See, we have plenty of examples. And if you are ass out, that's your own damn fault. That is the nature of racism today. That is the ideology of racism today. Personal responsibility and colorblindness. And so that's really, I think, why we have to reassert basic ideas about political economy, that racism doesn't just come from nowhere, that these ideas are not eternal, that they're not somehow disconnected from what's happening in the world, that they very much, that racism plays a social function. Many different social functions in a way. It's a way of not only dividing the working class, but racism remains profitable for huge sections of the ruling class. And also, crucially, racism remains an important ideology for just basic social control, for controlling, sections of the working class that get out of control or become militant or rabble-rousing. Racism plays a number of social functions in our society, and we have to argue, I think, that that's why racism persists, because it is so damn useful. And it is useful not to us, but it is primarily useful to the American ruling class, and that's why they set it up in those ways. And I think furthermore, we have to say that if it is so useful, if it is so essential to propping up American society, then for those of us who consider ourselves revolutionaries who are trying to change American society, if it's that important to them, then it must be equally important to us. It must be a priority for us. Not that the idea that racism is going to be abolished in some future state or some other side of capitalism, but that right now, if it's propping up the system, then it must be a priority for us to challenge it and tear it down. And that there's no way we're going to accomplish a transformation of this system unless we challenge this central prop of it. Thank you.